Okay, so yeah, we can start now. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is our last lecture for this term, and we'll continue with our lecture series in 2024, yes, after the holidays. And today our guest is Dr. David Ellis. David is a lecturer of philosophy, ethics, and religion at Leeds Trinity University. He works on religious language, belief, and life from Wittgensteinian perspective. And today, David will talk about Hume's and Wittgenstein's take on faith. So, David, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much. So for the next 30, 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about what David Hume and Wittgenstein's take is on the role of faith and reason in religious belief. To give a general summary of what we're going to aim to do, we'll begin by taking a look at David Hume's views. We'll just recap and refresh specifically on section 10 of the inquiry, being of miracles. And we're going to see how Hume describes miracles as being a kind of superstitious delusion, and the concern there being that if the authority of Christianity, of scripture, tradition, stands or falls entirely upon whether it's reasonable to believe that Christ was the real presence of God on earth on the basis of testimonial evidence in the Bible, then there's going to be some real trouble. But we're going to see that he seems to say, hold on a minute, it's not that much of a problem in the long run. And I think he performs a similar sort of move that Wittgenstein does, where Wittgenstein has this presentation of religion, where he says, if we're going to treat religious belief as something like a science, as something evidence data driven that needs reason and rational foundations and all of that, then if that's all it is, then it will be superstition. And that's a direct quote from his views in his lectures and conversations on religious belief. So they both seem to use this language of superstition if it's based upon reason, but both of them seem to say not only is religion not in the business of needing evidence, but that is actually to the credit of religion. So I'm going to spend some time taking a look at that relationship in a bit more detail and exploring some of the views that come from it. So the general direction of Hume's thought then, just again, a bit of a recap before we go into the nuts and bolts of his argument in Of Miracles, begins with this view that, well, let's say Christianity depends on whether Christ was the real presence of God. Now, without getting into any nitty-gritty Christology sorts of debates, the general view here is something perhaps more simple. The claim being that for Christianity, Jesus was more than just a very moral person. We wanted to say that there is more to Christ than that. And in this sense, that Christ was the real presence of God, whether we say half and half and all of that sort of stuff, that's perhaps a separate debate there. Now, what would it take to convince me or Hume that Jesus Christ was indeed the real presence of God? Well, Hume sets the argument up that miracles would be required. If you want to prove to me that you're God or something similar to that, you need to do something that only God could do. Thus a miracle. I wouldn't want you to run a marathon without needing a single glass of water. As remarkable as that is, it's not miraculous. It's not a sure sign of divinity. But if you can walk on water, if you can turn water into wine without any sort of chemical bizarreness, molecule movements, then we're really talking about something suitable as evidence. Well, with that in mind, what evidence do we have that Christ did do that? Well, we don't have any photographs, right? We don't have any like CCTV footage or anything like that. What we've got is testimonial evidence. We've got the reports in scripture that attest to the claim that Christ did do these things: walk on water, he himself raised from the dead, had a miraculous birth, and all the rest of it. Now, then Hume sort of pauses and says, well, it is wise to proportion our belief to the evidence. It's sort of like scales. And we say, well, the evidence for and the evidence against. When the weight tips, we side that way. And if we were to have 10 bits of evidence in favor for something and 5 bits of evidence against, we'll tentatively side perhaps in favor, but aware that there are counterpoints. So we want to proportion the belief. We want it to be in balance as best as we can. The question then arises, is testimonial evidence of the sort which Christianity provides in Scripture proportional to the belief that Christ did perform miracles? Is it suitable? Is the evidence credible enough? Could it lead you to believe that these miraculous events did indeed occur? And here we get an immediate answer in paragraph number 1, 10.1. Paragraph number 1, Hume writes, it would be directly contrary to the rules of just reasoning to give our assent to it. So this seems to set it off straight away. It all depends upon the credibility of testimonial evidence, and it would be contrary to the rules of just reasoning to assent to it. So this now looks like a problem. But he immediately follows up with this, and this is what really triggered some of my thoughts and led me to the talk today. He adds, when they are considered merely as external evidences and are not brought home to everyone's breast by the immediate operation of the Holy Spirit. And here I was thinking, well, what is this saying then? It seems to me to be saying something like, if we treat the testimonial reports that Christ performed miracles as bit by bit individual claims, separate to religious life, separate to religious worldviews, then, it's going to be a problem. It would indeed be contrary to the rules of just reasoning to take it on board. But this sort of implies that if they were considered as internal evidences, internal to what, but internal to something, where there is some closeness, some immediacy, and there is the operation of the Holy Spirit, then things might be different. And there I want to propose is some sufficient room to talk about the role of faith, that we need faith to operate. Now, maybe it might be a stretch, but we'll soon see that I want to try to convince you somewhat that this external evidences and internal, maybe it's internal to a religious form of life. That might be the Wittgensteinian side of me, but that's a general direction we'll be going. So let's see then in perhaps a bit more detail how exactly Hume makes this argument, so we can really see the danger in his mind of having reason at the foundation of Christian religion. Well, he famously has that phrase that he flatters himself to have discovered an argument which, if just, will with the wise and learned be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion. And there we immediately see some of the controversy that in the category of superstitious delusion, he is including belief in miracles, which may well be the foundations of Christian faith. Now, core to his argument is the emphasis of proportioning belief, that we proportion belief to evidence. And when we talk about evidence, we talk about it in various ways. We talk about the quantity. How much evidence do we have? How credible is it? So how reliable is it? Testworthy? Is the testimony given by a person who was drunk at the time of having seen what they report to having seen? Are they giving it under oath, or are they a notorious liar? And all these rest of things come about. We weigh it all up. We weigh up how credible the evidence is in favor, the strength of the evidence against, and then make a proportional belief claim. Now, in the words of Richard Wollheim in Hume and Religion, he believes that the crux of Hume's argument in Of Miracles is that the credibility of testimony can never be assessed independently of the plausibility of what it asserts, which is a bit wordy here. But when we are evaluating how credible the evidence is, we can't do it independent to the sort of claim it's making. We can't just pick it out of the context and just judge it in its own rights. There is some aspects integral to the nature of the claim that's being made that need to be considered when evaluating the suitability or credibility of the evidence. And as we already saw, there is this balance, there is a proportionality, there's a bit of a ratio going on here. We could phrase it perhaps like this. The more implausible the claim is, the more credible the testimony must be to lead me to believe in its truth. Right? As you say something more implausible, more mysterious, more extraordinary, the more and more demanding my burden of proof is going to be upon you, especially if it's based upon testimony. So let's have a look at perhaps an intuitive example of how this seems to work. Well, on the one hand, I'm not gullible. Well, I hope I'm not gullible. I'm not going to believe anything and everything anyone ever says, but at the same time, I don't want to be unnecessarily pedantic. So I'll take your word for some things. I'll take you at your word for it if what you report strikes me as plausible within the context. So, for example, if I asked you what the weather is right now, we were just talking about this right at the beginning, and somebody was to say to me, well, it's snowing. And if I knew you lived in somewhere like Finland or Sweden or something like that, I'd think, go figure, it's snowing in winter in Finland. Totally believable, happens all the time, strikes me as a very plausible thing. I'm not going to ask you to send me a video of the snow. I'll take you at your word. But if I knew that you lived in Sydney in Australia and you were to then tell me, hey, it's snowing on the beaches, I would think that's pretty implausible. Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I'm certainly going to say that's not very that's not very usual. It's atypical. I would probably need some evidence. I might think to myself, maybe you've been deceived. Maybe you're pulling a prank on me, but maybe you've been deceived. Maybe there is actually a film being shot there, and what you've seen is artificial snow, and you've muddled it up and haven't realized. Because it's more implausible, I want more and more credence from your evidence. But if you were to turn around and say, hey, it's raining dry water, well, that strikes me as so unbelievable. Literally, it's unbelievable. It would be miraculous. It strikes me as nearly impossible, right? I wouldn't know what would count as evidence that it is indeed raining dry water. So here we can start to see that the implausibility of the claim being made is proportional to the amount of credibility your evidence needs to be if you want me to believe that it is true. There is this scale, and it needs to be viewed in relation to one another. Now, here we start to find Hume making quite a novel argument, which is where he believes that there would be a mutual destruction if we were to ever supply the necessary evidence in favor of the miracle. So he reminds us that nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happened in the common course of nature. Everyday events are not miraculous, right? But it is indeed a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. Now, of course, for Hume, being an empiricist, and this would be perhaps a matter-of-fact claim, if we're going to go into perhaps more of the more dense nature of his epistemology, his point is to say, it is implausible because it goes against everything we've ever known to be the case. No one would expect it to be true. It's not that now and then, as a general rule of thumb, the dead don't come back to life. It's that all people of all ages and all countries have a uniform agreement. The dead don't resurrect. People can't just walk on water, and other sort of miraculous claims. So there must therefore be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. Otherwise, the event would not merit that appellation. So in order for it to be deemed a miracle, it must be the most implausible of all things. That is to say, all evidence needs to go against it, that there is no supporting evidence. The default position is that never happens. That doesn't happen. Hence, it's a miracle that Christ then goes ahead and does so. So where's the mutual destruction element here? Well, if you want me to believe that that claim is true, you need to give me more evidence in its favor than there is against it. The belief needs evidence which is greater or superior to uniform experience of all people of all ages and all countries. Already that's an incredibly high burden. But the self-destructive nature is something like this. If you were to give me that kind of evidence, you would in fact diminish the miraculous nature of the event, because its truth is now more plausible than its falsehood. And the point of it being a miracle is that it needs to be the most implausible. So there is a mutual destruction of arguments here. So where does this lead Hume? Well, it leads him somewhere like this. He writes, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavours to establish. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. So again, it's this matter of proportionality, the probability of it all. I weigh the one miracle against the other. So he's phrasing this as perhaps negatives. Rather than asking which is more plausible, he's asking which would be the greater miracle, the event being true or the evidence you're giving me being false. Which is the greater miracle? So I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision, and I will reject the greater miracle. So perhaps a less conceptually dense way of putting that is this: if the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. And simply put, no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any such system of religion. So at this stage, perhaps things look bleak, right? This appears to seriously undermine Christianity if Christianity and the legitimacy and authority of scripture and of church tradition stands or falls on whether it is reasonable to take testimonial evidence as proof that Christ performed miracles. If it all stands on that, things are looking very troublesome. However, what I think is perhaps surprising is Hume quickly follows up in his conclusion that I am the better pleased with the method of reasoning here delivered, as I think it may serve to confound those dangerous friends or disguised enemies to the Christian religion who have undertaken to defend it by the principles of human reason. So it seems as if there is a sudden change around. It's not that Hume has tried to attack Christianity and disprove it or debunk it by undermining it or something like this, but as if he's saying, actually, those dangerous friends, so out of good intentions, but are actually doing something harmful, of those disguised enemies who have came into the religion to corrupt it from the inside, those who are trying to swap the foundations of Christianity and trying to take faith and put reason there are actually a problem. They are actually a threat, and it's them that he is attempting to attack. Because our most holy religion is founded on faith, not on reason. And it is a sure method of exposing it to put it to such a trial as it is by no means fitted to endure. So we can demonstrate that Christianity was never supposed to be understood as based entirely upon reason, because if it were, well, it's not going to endure at all. So it's founded on faith. So faith seems to be taking a more authoritative position here. But what then is perhaps the role of faith? Well, Hume writes, mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity. So mere reason is just not good enough to convince us that Christ proved a divine mission through miracles based upon testimonial evidence. And whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. So those who are nonetheless moved or compelled for some reason or other to assent to the Christian religion are doing so through faith. And that is in some way or other miraculous. It is in some way or other at odds with reason and evidence. We might want to say there is no reason to believe, yet the people are nonetheless believing for some reason. So there is some now talk perhaps here about, well, what kind of reason is appropriate and whether faith is a reason and not, rational scientific evidence being the only form of reason you could have here. Now this, in my view, ties us quite nicely into some of the views that are expressed by Wittgenstein, who also presents it in a similar kind of way, where if it is all just a matter of needing evidence, of being a series of historical or scientific claims and facts, then again, we're going to be in real trouble. Now, to see this, it's useful to remind ourselves of the whole Wittgensteinian philosophical project. And I think he does well to capture it in the phrase, to imagine a language means to imagine a form of life. So for Wittgenstein, words are contextual. They don't have meaning baked into them. Words don't exist out there somewhere in the universe and we suddenly discover it. Rather, a word means what the word does within a language game, like pieces in games. If somebody were to ask me, what is a bishop in chess? I can say, well, a bishop is what a bishop does. It is a piece that can move diagonally, right? It doesn't have to be white or black. It doesn't have to be made of plastic or wood. You could have a Star Wars special edition chess set. It could be any particular shape you want it to be. What it is what it does in the context of the game. Now, in a similar way, what a game means is what it does in the context of a life. There is no meaning baked into a little wooden chess piece, and there is no meaning baked into the complete set of chess either. It is contextually meaningful all the way down. Words are meaningful in their language games. Language games are meaningful in their lives of the speaker, of the players. So we might be wondering, okay, Dave, this is all well and good, but I thought we were going to be talking about faith and reason and religion here. Why are we doing philosophy of language sort of stuff? Well, Wittgenstein has an approach arguing that, well, if we're going to think about religious language, we must think about the religious form of life. Or perhaps another way to put this, we need to stop thinking about isolated beliefs and say, here's a religious belief that we could kind of pull out of the life of the community, say, here it is. Let's ask what reasons you have for it, as if it comes with its own associated set of personalized reasons. Instead, we need to think about the full package. We need to think about the entire form of life and look at the various beliefs and attitudes and opinions and views found collectively within it. Then we have both a richer understanding of religion, and I believe we'll start to see that reason has less and less priority. And in fact, faith becomes more foundational. So what is that religious form of life like? Well, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm unable to list all the exact characteristics, in part because there is no single property, at least to Wittgenstein's later views. There isn't a religion-making property. There isn't a you are a religion if and only if you believe this. Instead, there is something more like what we would call family resemblance. There is lots of overlapping tendencies, traits, histories, functions, social roles that come together to resemble one another, just as family members do. There is nothing me and my sister that have absolutely metaphysically the same, but we have enough similarities to be categorized under the same family tree, hence the family resemblance. So what you would do in the late Wittgensteinian tradition when studying religion and religious belief is to ask, well, what are some of the common traits you may find among the things we're willing to call religion? And can we sort of hone in into them a little bit and unpick them and see if they offer something unique, something insightful? But one of the things I think is useful to point out is that religious people, not every religious person, of course, but it is not unordinary to say that religious people confess their belief in Christ. And usually people don't confess their belief in science. They don't tend to confess their belief in E equals MC square. Confession does not seem to be part of the game here. It doesn't seem to be an essential function. The question then comes, well, does this tell us something about religious life? That the belief is confessed? Does this tell us there is something behind the scenes worth knowing about? And does this tell us about the need for evidence? You're confessing it because it's a secret, because you know you've got no evidence and you don't want to be any kind of embarrassed. Like, what is a confession element about? Now, one of my preferred interpreters of Wittgenstein, being D.Z. Phillips, he believes that this does tell us something important. And one of my favorite quotes he gives, because I think he sort of hits the nail on the head with this example, is this very brief passage. He writes, when the positivist, so the logical positivist, when the positivist claims that there is no God because God cannot be located, the believer does not object on the grounds that the investigation has not been thorough enough, but on the grounds that the investigation fails to understand the grammar of what is being investigated, namely the reality of God. Of one thing he is certain, whatever is located is not God. So what's being said here is that if a person thinks to himself, if God exists, then he's got to be found somewhere. I'll just go look for him. Maybe he's under a stone in the Sahara Desert. Maybe he's in my sock drawer. And if only I looked more closely, I'd be able to find him hidden away somewhere. The believer does not say, no, you haven't looked hard enough. You need to use a telescope. Rather, the believer wants to say, you're looking in the wrong way. It's not that God is somewhere out there, hidden in the depths of the ocean, waiting to be detected by radar. Neither are miracles. The reality of a miracle is not out there either. It's not in the actual sandals are wet, but the knees are dry scenario of standing on water, right? It doesn't work like that. You're looking in the wrong sort of way. Now, this then starts to tell us, I think, something important about what would count as evidence, what would count as reason to believe. It's not going to be out there. So don't go looking for evidence out there. We need to go looking, perhaps something more internal. So Wittgenstein expresses in his lectures on religious belief. He writes, the point is that if there were evidence, this would in fact destroy the whole business. And I think this becomes a really important point, that if there were evidence, this would in fact destroy the whole business. Not that we don't have good enough evidence, but evidence of any kind would destroy the business of religion. Anything that I normally call evidence wouldn't in the slightest influence me. Religious beliefs are found in religious life, and this seems to be part of the reason for why it's not the requirement of evidence. A religious belief in miracles or a belief in the resurrection and atonement does not come at the end of a complicated mathematical formula and you hit the conclusion, go, oh, okay, it's true then, and now suddenly you got a religious belief. It seems to be the product of various dispositions, various emotions, various ways of thinking about the world. And evidence then isn't really here nor there. Evidence is not part of this puzzle. They're not built on evidence, so there is no good or bad evidence. There's no strong or weak kinds of evidence either. So in a similar way, if we were to put reason and belief in testimony of the apostles about the miracles of Christ, if that was absolutely the foundation, the standing point of Christian religion, well, it's going to be superstitious. For Hume and Wittgenstein is going to agree to. The point is that there is no evidence, or rather, it does not require evidence, irrespective to whether you think you've got it. It's more of a conjunction. You have a belief and evidence, as opposed to a belief if and only if evidence. There is a different kind of relationship taking place here. There are, though, reasons for belief. Because again, Wittgenstein points out, on the one hand, if there were evidence, it would destroy the whole business. But anything that I normally call evidence wouldn't influence me. He hasn't said nothing would ever influence me. I mean, obviously, we know people are influenced into a religion, so to speak, right? That you have atheists that convert to Islam. We know there is some narrative story. There is some explanation behind how it has come to be the case that you believe what you believe. But that personal testimony, perhaps interestingly, is not what we would normally call evidence. It would be a sufficient reason that it will account for how you have changed your mind, but it's not necessarily expected to convince me to change my mind personally. So Wittgenstein then gives an example to really try to convey this quite controversial view that we're not in the business of needing evidence here. He writes, suppose, for instance, we knew people who foresaw the future. They make forecasts for years and years ahead, and they described some sort of a judgment day. Queerly enough, even if there were such a thing, and even if it were more convincing than I have described, but belief in this happening wouldn't be at all a religious belief. Now, this way of thinking becomes important for other areas of Wittgenstein's work, where he asks perhaps the difference between the weather report telling you that it's going to rain next week and you not thinking that someone has just given you a prophecy, but instead a prediction. What would have made that a prophecy? So there is this sort of aspect there. But even if something like this was to happen, I wouldn't call it a religious belief. And that's the emphasis, I think, that he wouldn't call it one. He's not saying that he would just dismiss it entirely as false. I mean, he still believes in weather reports. The point is that a weather report belief is a scientific, perhaps, belief. It's not a religious one. There is something which a religious belief is like, and it's often at odds with evidence. It does not matter whether the evidence is in favor or against. It doesn't seem to work like that. This seems to be important for Wittgenstein's views. And I think we can see some relations with Hume again, that if it was all a matter of testimonial evidence, it'll be superstitious delusion. But despite knowing that we have no reason to believe, if you can't help but believe, there is some sort of active role of faith taking place there. Now, suppose, he continues, that I would have to forego all pleasures because of such a forecast. I'm told if I do this, then I'm going to be thrown into fire for thousands of years and all the rest of it. I wouldn't budge. The best scientific evidence is just nothing. And again, he isn't saying that he's not going to believe it. The point is that it would not move him into a religious believer. He wouldn't suddenly consider himself religious. So there seems to be this interesting challenge that we think usually that beliefs need evidence. And beliefs about Judgment Day seem to be as religious as they come or go. And if there's good evidence, then we should believe it. That seems to be the generic direction we want to think about. That sounds like a religious belief. If there's good evidence, we should believe it. But here he is saying, even if you were to show me with good evidence that such a thing was going to happen, I wouldn't call it a religious belief. He is trying to say that what makes a belief religious is not accountable to what the belief is about, but the role of the belief in the life of the believer. It's all about the context in the individual's life. If we believe because of evidence, then it isn't a religious belief, because religious belief is not in the business of needing evidence. It's something else, right? It's again this direction, this directional view. What makes it religious is its role within the individual's life. But of course, we do nonetheless find people trying to give good evidence, trying to give good reasons to believe in God. I mean, we've got cosmological arguments and teleological arguments, and we, of course, have people appealing to miracles and all the rest of it. Now, Wittgenstein doesn't want to say, like, that never happens. He wants to say the explanation for how that comes to be is compatible with the view he is here presenting. So that belief is formulated on the evidence, so when it's portrayed as being based upon evidence, can only be the last result in which a number of ways of thinking and acting crystallize and come together. So a form of life is weaved out of various strands. It's weaved out of emotions, interpretations of your past, of your history, hopes and aspirations of the future, other attitudes, other opinions, other factual beliefs. There's lots of little pieces that come together. We don't have some sort of religious making property that as soon as it's inside of a belief, you got yourself a religious one. It needs to be viewed in the broader context. Just in the same way, you don't have a chess making property that's found in a bishop, but isn't found in an ace of cards. You know, it doesn't quite work like that. So we grow a religious form of life in which beliefs take a religious shape, and then we ask about the evidence. If we were to begin the other way around and we would say, I will become a Christian if and only if you can convince me that it's reasonable to take these testimonies at their word, then you're going to face this Humean problem. But for Hume, it was faith to start with. Putting reason there is a problem. For Wittgenstein, he's saying a very similar thing, it seems, that it's not in the business of needing some reason-based evidence, and if you were to try to make it that way, you're actually causing a problem. And he gives an example of somebody who does just this. He says that O'Hara is one of those people who make it a question of science. He makes religious belief a question of science. And he says, I would definitely call O'Hara unreasonable. I would say, if this is religious belief, then it's all superstition, seeming again to have this overlapping view of judgment that Hume has as well. But I would ridicule it not by saying it is based on insufficient evidence. Well, why would he, on the one hand, ridicule it, but not for that reason? Well, it's because that might imply that there is such thing as sufficient evidence. I'm not going to say you've got bad evidence, aren't you so stupid? That would imply that there is good evidence. right? And this begins to tell us why he would actually ridicule it. I would say here is a man who is cheating himself. You can say this man is ridiculous because he believes and bases it on weak reasons. So this man is ridiculous. Why? Well, he has belief and then tells himself and others around him, perhaps as another way of telling himself, that it is because he has supporting evidence. He is fooling himself into something harmful in the long run. Because he is trying to say, I believe because of reason, not because of faith seeking some sort of reasonable based explanation. Perhaps O'Hara is one of those dangerous friends that Hume was warning us about at the beginning. Well, what then could lead one to God? I mean, it doesn't just happen overnight, or at least not usually. Now, in Culture and Value, we find Wittgenstein goes some way towards offering, again, an interesting view that lines with his overall approach. He explains that a proof of God's existence ought really to be something by means of which one would convince oneself that God exists. If you got proof and I hear it, I should believe it and therefore become a believer in God. But I think that what believers who have furnished such proofs have wanted to do is to give their belief an intellectual analysis and foundation, although they themselves would never have come to believe as a result of those proofs that they give us. Perhaps one can convince someone that God exists, in quotation marks, by means of a certain kind of upbringing, by shaping his life in such and such a way. Life can educate one to a belief in God. This makes me think, is this something similar to a whole faith-seeking understanding view, that over a period of time, the various experiences you have in life, toils and sufferings and experiences of awe and wonder, they come together and they crystallize, and before you know it, it sneaks upon you and you start to see the world in a religious kind of way. And then you want to know, why has this happened? Is this the better way of seeing things? Then you start doing this intellectual exercise and give post hoc reasons. And then you supply them as, here's proof that it's true. But that is only cheating yourself and others, in Wittgenstein's opinion. Maybe faith in miracles, and then that intellectual analysis of testimony with the aim of convincing others and themselves. Again, maybe it goes in that kind of order. Maybe there is a similar kind of link with what Hume was saying earlier, that we are led to see the world in a particular way, and in that way we come to see God. It's not that we come to find God hidden in the back drawer somewhere, but we come to see the world as a creation. And this perhaps brings us thoughts and ideas of a creator. So, wrapping this up, some concluding remarks, as I'm quite mindful we've covered a lot of ground here, perhaps. Of miracles appears to be a serious attack on the rational foundations of Christianity. It presents some serious challenges, and it's hard to see how it can be overcome. There are, of course, ways. People often critique his definition of a miracle, but nonetheless, it is taken to be an attack. But worry not. For Hume, at least, Christianity is based on faith, not reason, and this attack defends it from those who are trying to swap that faith for reason. We are defending the Christian tradition from those dangerous friends or disguised enemies. Now, for Wittgenstein, religious belief is going to be all superstitious if it is some sort of evidence-driven science, if we are to treat it in that kind of way. And so it seems for both of them, religion is not entirely in the business of needing reason and evidence in a usual sense, and that is actually a strength, not a weakness of religious tradition. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions and any comments.
Thank you very much, David. Wonderful talk, very inspirative, and with lots of content to think about. So please, any questions? Any questions from anybody?
I pose a question. I cannot find the reaction button, sorry. Can I?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much, David. I'm thankful for this talk, especially because I have I can say that I agree with you that maybe the style of Hume and Wittgenstein uh, uh, concerning this topic, the style of thinking is kind of similar, I think, and maybe this could even explain the popularity, let's say, of these philosophers, obviously, in the UK, maybe, and stuff like that. So, um, my question is the following: the distinction between evidence on the one hand, used for science, obviously, and on something other than this is key here. So we choose, we judge, choose, compare, whatever, the quality of scientific theories on the basis of evidence. So if we exclude, if we treat religion as something different than this, what can then be used to explain our comparison, our judgment between different kinds of religions? So what is this criterion of acceptance or of belief in a particular religion? Because obviously, I guess this is a practice that needs to be explained. This happens. This is a factual claim. People judge people judge different religions on the basis of something, but if it is not evidence, what is it? So it seems to me that Hume's way of giving an answer to this is like maybe a moral one, or a quasi moral. So he would say that, for instance, monotheism is better than polytheism or something like that, on the basis of how what it brings to a society, or what it brings to some group of people. So it would be kind of an answer would be, it brings virtue, it brings compassion, or something like that. So it is a moral answer, actually. My question is, do you think that Wittgenstein gave some kind of sui generis answer to this? So it's not like a moralistic answer. What makes a particular religion, good or better than the other one? Can we find a sui generis reason for this?
So, thank you very much. So the first thing you said about that there are some similarities, I agree. I mean, even outside of this context, they are both interested in understanding how we currently understand things, as opposed to just trying to fix problems, and that leads them towards comments on psychology. In fact, in the lectures and conversations, there is a couple of talks that are documented that Wittgenstein gave on psychology. So that's like an interesting overlap there too. Now, in terms of what do we judge them upon, I think Wittgenstein is going to give maybe two potentially unsatisfying answers. One is going to be that, sure, it is the case that people do make judgments between religions, and sometimes we make judgments about this is more socially beneficial, this is more politically beneficial, some Durkheimian view that this religion is gluing society together better than others are. Now, whether that counts as why they believe it is true is different. I suppose I could say, this is my favorite football team, and then I'll just find any reason to say why it's the best team, as opposed to having known those facts first, and those facts led me into the belief, right? I think that often we are doing this swapping around. Now, when Wittgenstein talks about, I'll go back a couple of slides. Yes, when he talks about here, when he says that here is a man who is cheating himself, we can say this man's ridiculous because he believes and bases it on weak reasons. I think part of what Wittgenstein is saying is that when we have a belief, and then we have what we take to be reasons for the belief, but they are not always prior. They're not always causal accounts for why one has came to hold those sorts of dispositions. So there is going to be this unsatisfying response of, there is one thing to describe how people are making their judgments, and then another discussion to be had, are they right to make those sorts of judgments? But when it comes to comparing religions, we can play a bit of like spot the difference. They're going to have enough in similarity to warrant the term religion. And this could be because of a common history. So take the Abrahamic traditions. there is enough historically in common with Islam and Christianity and Judaism to sort of trace back a common path. But if we're going to willingly say that Mormonism is a religion and Hinduism is a religion, then the similarities are not going to be based upon a common history. The similarities are going to be perhaps about what they are doing for that society, and perhaps what they are doing for the life of the believers. They're addressing existential problems, that there are going to be moral components to it too, perhaps. So yeah, it becomes a bit difficult. As far as I know, Wittgenstein doesn't sort of point at a religion and say that one's better. I think he would say that that's the wrong way of doing it. It's this is the game that's played in this community. It works for that community. That's why they play that game. And that's sort of the discussion is sort of finished there. to then say there is something underneath it, he says there is nothing beneath.
Yeah, it's kind of my mistake, or the mistake of someone who poses that question, is that he already went out of bounds actually by doing that. He already took it out of the context, I guess. They are
yeah, because
incommensurable, let's say like that. The religion, the religions are incommensurable. So, but this maybe has this let's say maybe a philosophically negative or academically negative consequence, that people who are, for instance, doing comparative religion, their actually endeavor is futile. I guess that is kind of maybe unwanted consequence of Wittgensteinian view.
So there is there. I suppose it depends what you're after in a way. I think Wittgenstein is going to make comparisons, but his exercise is entirely descriptive. So when we think about his philosophical project, he wants to leave what is ragged is one of the phrases he puts in the philosophical investigations. What is broken is left broken. What is messy is left messy. We're only to lay out what is already in front of us. So this sort of situation of doing more than that isn't the Wittgensteinian method of doing things. Though Hume will make more pronounced judgments. I mean, he seems to have a preference for teleological arguments, say. So there would be perhaps a difference there. But yeah, what this means for comparative religion though does become difficult. Though that is something that Michael Burley is researching, and he also writes about Wittgenstein. So he would be a good person to look for.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, maybe I can comment.
Of course.
Ask something. So what strikes me as very interesting is that, and it's very good that you were giving your lecture the last in this the whole series, because it kind of connects it to today. It starts with Hume, and Hume already is the beginning of our era, so to speak. So it's our modernity period. And connect it to Wittgenstein, to 20th century, and what we basically, how we grasp these concepts today. Now, what's interesting, and it came to me while you were speaking, is the very concept of evidence that we take for granted. I mean, in the last 300 years, the evidence is empirical evidence, and yes, sure, yeah, it changes, and then now evidence is something processed in the data, processed in the computer, not just something done in the lab, not something witnessed. It's just, but it's basically, we have this kind of concept of evidence. Now, it would be neat, and that's just something to think about. It's not even a question, to think about what counted as evidence before our times, before modernity, how what we see, or what people in late antiquity, for example, thought about what is evidence for something, and whether the concept of evidence was the same. Yeah, and I don't think it was the same, probably. What comes to my mind is, for example, medieval theologian and also alchemist, not Francis Bacon, but Roger Bacon.
Mm-hmm.
That comes a couple of centuries before Francis Bacon, who, for example, says, we need to work on prolonging our lives to 600 years or 700 years, because we know that's how long people back in the biblical times lived. So you know what I mean. But that's only one, that's kind of extension of what we mean as the evidence. But the other thing is, and I found that very interesting in Peter Harrison and John Milbank's book Territories of Science. And before our modern times, people did not think of empirical evidence as something that confirms some beliefs, but when they witness something, they treat that as a sign of something. Higher power, hidden spirits. Our universe was kind of populated with many, many beings. And what we see is the sign of the hidden powers, personal or impersonal, it doesn't really matter. So there is no question here. It's just something to think about, that it's and how that changed slowly up until Hume, and then from Hume. The other thing, people within church had to actually struggle with what they held to be superstition. And Marcella, who is around here, she was talking about what St. Augustine thought, how to fight superstition among the... so this enchanted universe, they were at one point in the higher Middle Ages said, well, we have to kind of think what kind of spiritual beings are out there. So they had to cut them down. And Thomas Aquinas said, well, okay, there are angels, there are demons, there is God, of course, and there are us, and no others, dwarfs or some kind of, fairies or whatever. These are superstitions. There is really no question here. I'm just trying to reconstruct because Hume is already somehow, it grew on us. He's the way we think about faith and about science, about evidence, and about how to believe in God without evidence. But before that, the world was kind of the metaphysics was blurred with spiritual beings. It was far more populated than our world, which is kind of dead and inert, and kind of mechanical motion is out there, and God is somewhere outside. And Hume and Descartes, Rasko and I were working about something regarding Descartes. That's the period when all of a sudden the worldview changes from this populated world to this barren world. A barren world is the world of science, and where God is outside of it, outside in every possible sense. And as you pointed out, if there is evidence for God, it's really not really religious belief anymore. Which I really, it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. It's yes, it would be trying to find the reality of chess in the chess set. It's a similar sort of thing. It's not actually out there, and it's never pretended to be out there. But perhaps there is something about the scientific or materialistic way of thinking about the world, which says, well, if it's real, then it's got to be. And the greatest form of real is something that is mind independent and objective and a priori, and it strips it of the humanness. It strips it of the subject element, and then it's like, well, we may as well disregard all of the arts in the process here. So I think that I think there was also this other transition, similar to what you were saying about maybe during early modern and Enlightenment era, there was perhaps, whether it was a conscious awareness, probably became so towards the end of the era, that a great deal of what we see in the world might be because of our upbringing or our culture or our society, and there is perhaps this projection element that we see the world in a way that makes sense to us. And then perhaps there was this move with like a scientific way of thinking, which was to try to look at the world without that sort of background. You put your beliefs and myths at the door when you come into the lab, sort of thing. That there is now a way of looking at it without that background. But I think Wittgenstein is saying that we've gone too far now the other way. We're now trying to pull religion out of the human world and view it as if it's some molecule. So yeah, the God particle for him, I think, would cause him to chuckle for a similar sort of reason. The scientification of something that isn't meant to be scientific. And then we all complain that we can't find it anymore. It's sort of like, you're looking in the wrong way.
I agree. For Wittgenstein, it's absolutely the case. Whatever is the most meaningful for me or for our lives is not scientific. So that, and he liked to say, I really don't care much about scientific questions and their answers. What I care about is aesthetics and God and ethics, and these are all outside of scientific realm. So yeah, and of course God is out there too, and these are the most meaningful things for our existence, and they're out of the realm of science, all of them.
Absolutely. Even for early Wittgenstein, God is outside of language. We must remain quiet. So it's a similar sort of thing there.
Exactly. So whenever we talk about God, it's senseless. All of our propositions are senseless, and nonetheless the most important for us. So that's what Vienna Circle didn't like.
Exactly. And it is the most meaningful. Again, I'm sort of vibing off this because with Wittgenstein, I think it was in his lecture on ethics, where he says he wouldn't for a moment ridicule it.
Yes,
he wouldn't. He would take it seriously, though at the same time seriously because it is not science. If it were science, it is now ridiculous.
It is
so
not...
it's that. Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you, and I apologize for blabbering, but
no, don't worry.
Inspired me thinking about the whole thing. So anyway, any other questions?
I could. Sorry.
Yes.
If thank you, David, very much for this lecture, especially for clear-cut presenting of Wittgenstein position, which I like very much in this respect. And but I would like to put a question concerning Hume's directions when you gave some thesis of his direction of thought, and the second one was that only miracles could prove that the first thesis, which is that Christ is not just was not just a human, but God and human at the same time. Yeah, that he's God, and I wonder why. About this thesis, why miracle must be necessary for such thing, because we have really that Christ made a lot of miracles, making, for example, from water wine or many others. But in some other cases, if I'm not wrong, he didn't want to make miracle, as for example when he was asked by Satanas to make some and he rejected to do anything else. So we think that why miracle in that case should be considered as necessary for proving that this is that he's God.
Right. So I think with Hume, he's setting up the argument in such a way as to say, if your claim is that you're more than just a person, more than just a human, I want you to do something more than what a human could do. You need to do something extraordinary. I mean, in the literal definition, extra to the ordinary, beyond human natural capacity. Now, if you were to just, I don't know, fly around, right? I don't want you to be some mutant human. Like some hybrid animal of some sort. The idea is that if your claim is that you're the creator and sustainer of all things that contingently exist, that you are God, then we want you to do something that only God could do. Now, why there is a sheer number of miracles, like surely only one would suffice, right? If he didn't turn water to wine, I don't know whether we're going to go, that's one miracle too few now, right? I suppose that might be part of just a narrative story. Likewise about the refusal to perform certain miracles at anyone's beck or call. Maybe again there is some sort of theological interpretation to be had there that we cannot command God to perform miracles just because it suits our agenda, or who are we to question God? There might be that side of it too. But for Hume, the argument is that if your claim is that you are no mere mortal, you are indeed on some divine mission, then you need to do something that only an individual of that capacity could do. And there comes the argument of the miracle. But that becomes a problem. And that becomes a common critique of Hume's position, because he defines a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, as opposed to a suspension of the laws of nature. And that becomes quite a problematic debate. But that might be to the side of whether we like Hume's argument of miracles. Part of the reason why I was talking about it today was to say that there is an alternative, hopefully plausible interpretation to take towards Hume as putting faith in the priority. Now, whether we say all of this focus on miracles is a problem, maybe Hume would say, well, that might not actually be an issue anyway, because religion isn't based upon the reasonability of belief of miracles. But maybe there is more of a faith-based interpretation of a miracle, that a miracle happens in one's life, not out there in the world. That might be a view that would be found more in existential theologians. But yeah, the sheer number of miracles, I don't know why there is so many. Maybe part of it is to fulfill prophecies of the Old Testament. Maybe that is part of the reason too. I'm not sure if that's quite directly answered your questions, though. Sorry.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, in regard to what Dan was saying, when you look at these desert fathers from late antiquity, or John and Barsanuphius, these are the most familiar to me. There is this feeling. They usually say that maybe not explicitly, but the times of miracles is behind us. So we should be kind of suspicious of whoever is saying that they've seen a miracle nowadays, and that's like 6th century. So there is this kind of, that's behind us. Now we rely on faith, and faith alone. And there are some miracles, and they do mention occasionally that so and so did the miracle. That somebody was healed not by natural means but by miracle. So miracle in that case is some other kind of ways that somebody is healed, not through remedies like the plants or something, minerals or something that is usually that has healing power. So they do accept the miracles, but they insist they are rare and that we should be cautious about them. I don't know. I just interrupted. Sorry.
No. I think for Hume, it's almost, I take Hume to be saying something like, if this hypothetical person is going to make the argument that it is based all upon reason and it is based upon testimony and miracles, then he's going to take it in those literal terms and say it's actually a problem. I mean, because it's in those terms. Hume also writes. I've got his chapter here. He writes also that so that upon the whole we may conclude that the Christian religion not only was at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one.
Okay, no. I understand what you are saying. For Hume, if you believe, and that's basically, I think Dan would agree, and it's in the basis of Christianity as well. If you believe only based on the performance of the miracle, that's not really your faith. That's not really faith. That's not really belief.
If I understand well, Wittgenstein would agree completely.
Yes.
Yeah. It's all agreement here. Yeah. For Hume, if that was your basis, it's going to fall. And
That's
for Wittgenstein, it never was to begin with, so don't worry about it. So
there is that Dan, you will know, there is that favorite line of mine from Gospels where I think Christ says, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." Or I'm paraphrasing now. It's somewhere there when he resurrects, but Thomas,
Thomas, yeah,
Thomas
Apostle Thomas.
wants to, and you had you had
yeah.
like, oh, can I touch your wound? Right? Okay, you can, sure, now you know, but blessed are those who believe without that. So I like that.
Yeah, no, I do, yeah.
Yeah, Christ said to 70 apostles, because before they sent them, he also said that they should not pretend to make miraculous healings. Yes, it is not so important. They asked him why they didn't perform miracle as he did before. Yes, he said it is not. It should not be your. You should not pretend to do this anytime. It is not the most important thing. Yes, I must paraphrase this. Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry for interrupting. John cannot. The mic is not working. But he has a question. So I'll just read in the notes, in the messages. He says, "I have a question, but I'm unable to use the mic." Can you say something further? I think you, David, further on the role and status of the notion of fate in Hume's philosophy. Nice talk and very interesting take on Hume. That's from John.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So the role of faith, it's sort of interesting and peculiar. When I read it initially in Miracles, my first time reading it round, I perhaps was a bit cynical about it, because I know that Hume, for example, published of Miracles posthumously, probably because he was very aware of the controversial nature of what he's about to write. And it does sort of feel like the middle part is all a reason-based undermining argument of the authority of miracles and the rest of it. And then he just slaps at the beginning and the end. He sandwiches it. Faith, though, don't worry. That was my first reading of it. And I thought, well, maybe that's maybe a bit too cynical. Now, whether he is actually really trying to motivate a call for faith, I'm unsure. Now, his role of faith overall might be a bit tricky to go into. I'm not too sure of Hume talking explicitly about faith in philosophy of religion, though he does talk about beliefs which are without evidence in unusual-ish sort of circumstances, where perhaps on the one hand, so take, for example, when he has something like the problem of induction, when on the one hand, we have reason to believe that just because things in the past have been in a certain way, does not evidence it'll be like that way in the future. So on the one hand, we have reason to doubt the inductive method, but on the other hand, we can't help but have the inductive method. That there is again this tension between reason saying perhaps one thing and us feeling compelled or psychologically unable to process information in an alternative way. And maybe there is a similar sort of discord here between again those where he talks about not having reason. Yeah, and so I'm trying to quickly get the slide again. Oh yeah, that mere reason is insufficient to convince us of the veracity of religious belief, but those who are moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of some miracle performing within them anyway. So perhaps you could say that mere reason is insufficient to convince us of the veracity of something like causal determinism, because Hume might be skeptical of causation, but then on the other hand, he seems to be a bit of a determinist anyway. So there seems to be a bit of a tension, but that's not really addressing the role of faith. Again, I haven't really seen him write much on faith, and that might just be me being ignorant, and I should probably look at it more. But I do nonetheless see similar signs of him saying reason leads us one way, but we can't help but go the other. Be it about cause and effect not being real, but we can't help but act like that, or be skeptical about it, but we are overly committed to it. Similar with induction, similar about what that means more deeply about impressions being the causes of ideas, if there is no causation. Again, there is this tension in his views, and he is aware of this in places. And he just seems to just openly say, yeah, I don't know what to do about it. So that, again, might be a bit of a disappointing answer. Perhaps he has written more about it, and I'm just not all that aware, unfortunately.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I wish you all a nice break. We have holidays coming up, and stay tuned. We'll continue in later January, after the 15th, and we will announce our speakers for the spring series. So stay in touch, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you, everyone. Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.